None of her children attended her last birthday party. Months later, when claiming their inheritance, they received the real blow as they read the will and didn't hear what they expected. Mrs. Norma was sitting by the window of her room, staring at the garden she had tended for years. The roses that bloomed in shades of red and pink were the same ones her children, when they were little, had helped her plant, laughing and running around her. She remembered those laughs clearly, as if they still echoed in the air, and a deep sadness took over her as her aging hands toyed with the edge of a hand-embroidered tablecloth she had made herself. The previous night had been her birthday, a day she eagerly anticipated, and which ended in the loneliest and most unexpected way possible. Mrs. Norma had prepared everything to receive her children and spend a family evening. She had called each one, ensuring that they all remembered the commitment and marking the date on the calendar with enthusiasm. She prepared their favorite dishes, decorated the table with her finest linens, and placed fresh flowers in every corner. Yet, the night passed in absolute silence, without a single call, without a visit. With the clock striking 10 in the evening, Mrs. Norma finally accepted the reality: her children would not come. The sense of emptiness was overwhelming. She felt like a stranger in her own life, as if the family she had formed and cared for with so much love had vanished without a trace. "Have I failed so much that they forget me like this?" she whispered in the darkness of the room, where the candles she had lit at the beginning of the night had already burned out completely. The next morning, her sadness had turned into a cold, firm resolution. She knew there was nothing she could do to change the past, but she could leave a lesson for her children that would endure beyond herself. She dialed her lawyer, Ricardo, and waited for him to answer. "Mrs. Norma? How are you?" Ricardo asked, in his usual kind voice, though surprised to hear from her so early. "Ricardo, I want to make some changes to my will," she said bluntly, her tone resolute. "Something has changed, and I think it's time for my children to receive one final lesson." There was a moment of silence before Ricardo responded, immediately understanding the importance of her words. "I understand, Mrs. Norma. Tell me what you have in mind, and I'll make sure everything is arranged as per your wishes." Mrs. Norma spent the following hours explaining to Ricardo in detail each of the stipulations she wanted to include. She knew her children, each in their own way, had forgotten the roots, values, and love she had taught them. She wanted them, at least in her absence, to remember the importance of family and the bonds that, though invisible, should be unbreakable. The days passed, and a cold winter covered Mrs. Norma's garden. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving her children the legacy that had cost her so much to decide. Months later, her children received the notification about the will. Each of them, seeing the lawyer's call, felt a mix of emotions, from indifference to greed and curiosity. They found themselves gathered again in the living room of the house, which now felt strange to them, waiting to hear what each would receive. Ricardo looked at them silently, assessing their faces as he arranged the papers on his desk. "Before we proceed, I want to tell you that your mother left precise instructions for this will. Each of you will receive something from her, but not without meeting certain conditions," Ricardo began, in a tone that allowed no objections. Claudia, the eldest, frowned, visibly uncomfortable. "Conditions? This feels like a game." "My mother was always complicated, but this is ridiculous," she said, crossing her arms and casting a look of disdain at her siblings. Felipe, sitting next to her, leaned forward with a carefree air, but with a spark of interest in his eyes. "I don't see the problem, Claudia. If we just have to meet a few conditions, it won't be so hard, right?" he asked, trying to ease the situation. Teresa, however, remained silent, observing the room with a mixture of nostalgia and resentment. Returning to that house, full of memories that caused more pain than joy, had not been easy for her. "Let's continue, please." "I don't want to spend more time here than necessary," Teresa said quietly. Ricardo nodded and continued. "Donna Norma left specific tasks that each of you must complete in the house. Only after each of you has spent a week here and followed her instructions will the will be revealed." There was a murmur of surprise. No one had expected this. Claudia was the first to speak, her disbelief evident. So, we'll only know what she left after spending a week here? This doesn't make sense. What kind of lesson is she trying to give us? She asked, looking at Ricardo with suspicion. A lesson on what really matters, he replied calmly. Perhaps she wanted you to understand something she couldn't express in life. Felipe, always the most practical, shrugged. I guess I can be the first. After all, what's a week in this house? It won't be that hard, he said, not yet grasping the depth of his mother's decision. Claudia looked at him with a mixture of resignation and irritation. Do what you want, Felipe. I don't have time for games, but if I have to do it, I will, she said, closing the matter with coldness. Ricardo handed each of them a sealed envelope with each sibling's name carefully written on it. Seeing her own name in her mother's handwriting, Teresa felt a pang in her chest, remembering it as the same script her mother used to write notes of encouragement when she was a child. Felipe was the first to open his envelope, reading the first lines of his mother's letter in silence. My dear Felipe, you have lived your life running from many things, some important, others less so. I want you to spend these days in the house and discover who you really are, beyond appearances. In the library, you'll find something that will help you remember who you used to be and what you once dreamed of becoming. Sometimes, the true value of life lies in remembering where we come from. Felipe looked at Ricardo with a mixture of confusion and amusement, not knowing whether to take this request seriously. But something in his mother's words, in the precision that seemed to understand him better than he dared admit, awakened his curiosity. Seeing that Felipe was willing to accept the challenge, Claudia sighed with resignation and opened her envelope. Reading her mother's words, she felt the control she always held over her emotions start to crack. My dear Claudia, I know you have always been strong and determined, and that strength has taken you far. But I also know that, deep down, you carry a burden you haven't let go of. In my room, there is something that belonged to your grandmother and me. I want you to find it and understand why I kept it for you. Sometimes, a person's true power lies in accepting their vulnerability. Her mother's words struck Claudia more than she wanted to admit. She put the letter away in silence, avoiding her siblings' eyes. In that moment, she understood that the week in the house would be more challenging than she had anticipated. Lastly, Teresa opened her envelope with trembling hands, reading the message her mother had left her. My dear Teresa, I know you have often felt misunderstood, and I have made mistakes with you. But I also know that you have a strong and generous heart. I want you to spend time in the garden where we used to plant flowers together. There, you'll find something that may help you remember the good moments. The garden is a place of rebirth, and you deserve to heal and grow. A heavy silence filled the room as each finished reading their letters. They understood that the week in the family home would be more than just waiting to receive an inheritance. It would be a confrontation with their own fears, their mistakes, and with a mother who, even after her death, had found a way to give them one last lesson. Ricardo stood up and, with one final look at the siblings, gave them some parting words. Your mother loved you, of that I am sure. This is her last display of love, even if it's hard to understand now. I hope you can use this opportunity to discover what she wanted for you. The siblings, each deep in thought, left the room in silence, aware that what awaited them in that house would be more than just a simple week of waiting. Hours later, Felipe was standing in front of the door of his mother's old house, looking at the facade with a mix of nostalgia and discomfort. It had been a long time since he last stood there, and the idea of spending an entire week in that place, alone and facing the memories of his childhood, caused an unease he preferred not to acknowledge. He sighed and crossed the threshold. The silence of the house wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, and for a moment, he thought he saw his mother sitting in the living room with that serene and challenging expression she always had. Felipe shrugged, trying to shake the image from his mind, and headed directly to the library, as instructed by the letter she had left him. The library was a space his mother had treasured throughout her life. The dark wooden shelves were filled with books of all kinds, from novels to volumes of philosophy that Felipe had never understood. At the back, on the desk, he found an envelope with his name, patiently waiting to be opened. He picked it up with some reluctance and broke the seal. Felipe began the letter in his mother's unmistakable handwriting. I want you to rediscover something within yourself this week, something you've always carried but set aside. I know you've become a practical man, someone who doesn't allow himself to dream about things that aren't tangible. However, I know there's still a spark of creativity, a passion for life inside you. In one of the drawers of this desk, you'll find a notebook you gave me years ago, filled with your first poems and stories. Take the time to read it. If you have the courage, I want you to write again, to let yourself be vulnerable. Sometimes, my son, in the words we create, we find truths we didn't even know we carried within. Felipe left the letter on the desk and felt a knot in his stomach. He remembered that notebook, a small leather-bound book he had filled in his youth with clumsy verses, dreams, and thoughts that now seemed naive and embarrassing. He hadn't written since then, and in his adult life, he considered that facet of himself as something distant, almost unreal. He opened the drawer, and there it was, the notebook with the worn leather cover. He took it in his hands, surprised that his mother had kept it for so many years, and opened it with some trepidation. His own verses greeted him from the yellowed pages, words that sounded strangely familiar and, at the same time, foreign. Minutes passed as Felipe turned each page, recalling what he had felt when he wrote those poems, the yearning for something more, the need to express his inner self without fear. At some point, his eyes grew moist, and he had to pause to take a deep breath. Wow, Mom, you really knew how to challenge me, even now, he murmured to himself, as his fingers gently touched the words written years ago. He decided he would fulfill his mother's request. Perhaps it was more than just a simple task. Perhaps, after all, it was something he also needed. That same night, after dining alone in the empty dining room, he sat at the desk, took a pen, and opened a blank page in the notebook. Well, let's see if there's still any poetry left in me, he said quietly with a sad smile. The words began to flow haltingly at first, but little by little, he immersed himself in the act of writing. It was a cathartic process, as if each word connected him with a part of himself he had ignored for too long. His mind traveled to childhood memories, to moments shared with his siblings, to his mother's voice guiding him in those days when the family was still united. Over the following days, Felipe continued to write with increasing intensity. It wasn't easy to face his own thoughts and emotions, especially those he had buried to maintain the facade of a practical, detached man. Yet, the writing forced him to see who he really was and to accept the feelings he had denied for so long. One afternoon, as he reread what he had written, he realized he had written a poem about his mother without even planning it. The words reflected his love for her, his resentment, and finally, his forgiveness. At some point, he had cried as he wrote, and looking at the dry tears on the paper, he realized he was allowing himself to heal a wound he didn't even know he had. At that moment, he heard the sound of a message on his phone. It was from his sister Claudia, who seemed impatient to know how he was and what he had done during his week at the house. "Is everything okay, Felipe? Have you become a poet again?" She asked with a veiled irony that couldn't completely hide a hint of genuine interest. Felipe smiled and decided to call her instead of replying with a message. When Claudia answered, her voice sounded kinder than usual. "You know?" Felipe began, "I don't know if I'm becoming a poet, but I realized that Mom knew me better than I thought. I think, somehow, she knew I needed this." Claudia sighed on the other end of the line. "I don't know what Mom was trying to accomplish with this, Felipe. Sometimes I feel like she's manipulating us from beyond. But I have to admit that this experience also made me see some things differently." Felipe nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Maybe that's exactly what she wanted, Claudia. For each of us to confront something we had set aside, to reconnect with that part of ourselves we ignore. Maybe she was trying to bring us together in some way. There was silence on the line, and for a moment, Felipe thought Claudia had hung up. However, she responded in a soft, almost vulnerable voice. "I hope you're right, Felipe, because I feel that if I don't make the most of this, I'll always regret it." They said goodbye in silence, and Felipe returned to his notebook, to his poems and thoughts, with the determination to make the most of those final days in the house. On the last night, before leaving, he sat in the library, looking at the painting hanging on the wall. It was a painting of a mountainous landscape, the place his mother used to take them to as children for vacations. For the first time in a long time, he felt a deep peace, as if the weight of expectations and resentments had lightened. He understood that this week in the house had been more than just a task in the will. It had been an invitation to rediscover himself, to remember his roots and value what truly mattered. Before leaving, he wrote one last poem in his notebook. It was a farewell, a thank you letter to his mother for giving him that final lesson. He closed the notebook and left it on the desk as a tribute to everything he had discovered that week. As he closed the door to the house, Felipe felt changed, a different man than the one who had crossed the threshold days before. His mother had given him the gift of reclaiming a part of himself, and although he didn't yet know what he would do with it, he was determined not to ignore it again. Teresa arrived at her mother's house with a heavy heart, feeling the dense air of nostalgia and resentment as soon as she crossed the threshold. She knew her week in that house would not be easy. Unlike her siblings, Teresa did not feel that there was anything there for her to rediscover. The only thing that brought her back were the words in her mother's letter, a message she had read several times, trying to find some sense behind those lines. My dear Teresa, I know that you have often felt misunderstood, and maybe I was part of that. But I also know that you have a strong and generous heart. I want you to spend time in the garden where we used to plant flowers together. There, you'll find something that may help you remember the good times. The garden is a place of rebirth, and you deserve to heal and grow. Teresa sighed, unsure how to take that message. She looked around the house, so full of memories that seemed to mock her, reminding her of the child she had been, always feeling in the shadow of Claudia, the older sister who excelled at everything. Teresa was the middle child, the one who always seemed to be struggling to find her place in a family that, in her eyes, considered her invisible. She left her bag in the hallway and headed to the garden as her mother had requested. She crossed the living room silently and opened the door to the outside, finding the old garden that, despite the years, still held glimpses of its former glory. There were flower beds and colorful shrubs that her mother had lovingly tended. She remembered how, as a child, she had joined her there, helping to plant bulbs in spring, eagerly awaiting the first flowers. She sat on a moss-covered stone bench and allowed the memories to flood her. Minutes passed, and the sounds of the garden, the gentle whisper of the wind, the distant song of birds, immersed her in a state of calm she hadn't felt in years. There, in the midst of that silence, she realized how much she had missed those moments. Suddenly, she felt something in her hands. She had been absent-mindedly playing with the dirt near her feet, and her fingers touched something metallic and cold. She dug a little deeper until she uncovered a small, rusted box buried next to the rose bushes. She opened it carefully and found a series of photographs and an envelope with her name on it. She took the photos and examined them one by one. In each of them were scenes from her childhood. There she was, laughing alongside her mother in the garden, both covered in dirt. In another, her mother helped her make a bouquet of flowers. They were happy moments, and in each image, she saw the tenderness in her mother's expression, the affection she had forgotten amid so many misunderstandings. With tears in her eyes, she opened the envelope and read the brief letter her mother had left for her. Teresa, I always thought you understood love in its purest form, through the patience and dedication you gave to everything you touched. I know I made mistakes, and I'm sorry if I ever made you feel less special. Every time you came to the garden with me, I felt that we shared something unique, something that was just ours. I kept these photos because, in those days, you taught me more about life than anyone else. You may have forgotten over time, but I want you to remember, your capacity to love and care is your greatest strength. And I hope that someday you can forgive me for any pain I caused and discover that strength within yourself. Teresa closed the letter with a lump in her throat. Those words resonated within her in a way she had not anticipated. At some point in her life, She had stopped seeing that side of herself, the kind and compassionate side her mother had seen so clearly. Suddenly, the image she held of herself, as someone constantly on the defensive, mistrustful, wavered. She spent hours in the garden, feeling that for the first time in years, the resentment she had carried toward her mother was beginning to dissolve. That evening, as she was lost in thought, she heard her phone ring. It was Claudia. She hesitated a moment before answering, but something within her urged her to pick up. "Hello, Claudia," she greeted, trying to sound calm, though her voice still vibrated with emotion. "Hi, Teresa. I just wanted to see how you're doing there. Felipe told me his week there did him a lot of good, and I thought, maybe you'd like to talk." Claudia replied with a voice that, to Teresa's surprise, sounded genuine. Teresa sighed and leaned back against the stone bench, watching the flowers sway with the wind. "It's complicated, Claudia. I really didn't expect to feel this way. I found a box in the garden with photos and a letter from Mom. I don't know, I guess I always thought she didn't understand me, but now I realize there were things I just didn't see." Claudia was silent for a few seconds before responding. "I've realized a lot of things too, Teresa. Maybe we judged Mom in the wrong way. I always thought she expected too much from me, and that made me feel constantly indebted to her. Maybe each of us saw only a part of Mom and missed the rest." Teresa nodded, though her sister couldn't see her. Claudia's words awakened something in her, a recognition she hadn't wanted to accept until now. "You know, Claudia, I think we spent our lives comparing ourselves and drifting apart when, in reality, maybe we had more in common than we thought," Teresa said, letting the words flow freely. Claudia smiled on the other end of the line, and Teresa could feel that connection through the phone, something she hadn't experienced in years. "Maybe we still have time to change that, Teresa," Claudia said softly. That conversation lingered in Teresa's mind for the rest of the week. During her days in the house, she continued visiting the garden, tending to the flowers, reconnecting with those moments she had shared with her mother, as the barriers of resentment she had built began to dissolve. On the last afternoon, before leaving, she picked a small bouquet of flowers, a mix of lilies and roses from the garden, and placed it on the living room table, as a silent tribute to her mother, whom she was finally beginning to understand. As she left the house, Teresa felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. For the first time in years, she felt she had found something real and lasting, something her mother had tried to teach her from the beginning: the importance of healing and letting go of pain. The time in the house gave her a lesson beyond any material inheritance. It was a legacy of love and understanding, and as she walked away, Teresa knew she was ready to rebuild the bonds with her family and herself, starting anew from the most essential place: forgiveness. Daniel arrived at the family home on a cloudy morning, wrapped in a feeling of uncertainty and skepticism. He had been the last to arrive, postponing his week in his mother's house as much as he could, almost as if resisting was a way to protect himself. He had spent most of his adult life distanced from his family, taking refuge in a quiet, solitary life that, while isolating, also provided him with a certain peace. However, he knew that this time in the house would bring him something that, though he feared, he needed to face. He entered slowly, leaving his bag in the foyer and observing the living room with analytical eyes. Silence filled the place, barely interrupted by the sound of his steps on the wooden floor. He walked over to the desk in the living room, where Ricardo, the lawyer, had left him a letter with instructions from his mother. He took the envelope, noticing his mother's handwriting on the paper, and felt a knot in his stomach as he opened it. "Dear Daniel," the letter began. "You were always my quiet child, the one who watched without saying too much, keeping his thoughts to himself. I don't know if I ever understood your need for distance, for independence, but I want you to know that, at all times, I watched you with a mother's love and admiration. This week in the house will be a time for you to revisit your memories and face the things you left behind. In the attic, you'll find a box of your old books, the ones you used to read as a child and that fascinated you. My hope is that, in reuniting with them, you'll also reunite with a part of yourself that you forgot. Perhaps you'll find something that gives you the courage to reconnect with your family and with yourself." Daniel sighed and put the letter in his pocket, feeling a mixture of resignation and curiosity. He walked up to the attic with steady steps, trying to convince himself that this wouldn't affect him, that he would simply fulfill his mother's request and leave without further complications. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with old boxes, furniture covered in sheets, and objects that seemed like ghosts from other times. In the back, between two old trunks, he found the box his mother had mentioned, full of disorganized books with worn covers and bent corners. He sat on the floor and began to go through them one by one, surprised to recognize some of his favorite titles from childhood and adolescence. As he leafed through the pages, memories began to flow, bringing with them emotions he hadn't expected. Each book reminded him of a different time in his life, of nights spent reading alone in his room, while his siblings played in the garden or his mother read in the living room. In those days, reading had been his refuge, his way to escape and build his own world. Exploring the box, he found a small notebook hidden among the books. Upon opening it, he discovered a series of notes written by his mother. Some were brief messages, written in the margins of the pages, affectionate comments and reflections that revealed a side of her he had never considered. "Daniel, this was the first book you read on your own. I watched you from the door and saw how immersed you became in each word. I can still see you with those intensely focused eyes. This book made you cry. You never told me why, but in your tears, I understood how deeply you felt." Daniel flipped through the pages in silence, noticing the care and affection his mother had put into each of these details, in each of these observations. Over the years, he had assumed his mother didn't understand him, that she wasn't interested in getting close to him because he had distanced himself. Yet, this notebook showed him something different. His mother had been there, attentive to every part of his life, even when he thought no one noticed. The days in the house passed quickly. Daniel dedicated himself to reading each of his old books, to rereading his mother's comments, and with each page, he felt how the barriers he had built around himself began to fall apart. It was as if his mother's words, after so many years, finally allowed him to see the love she had always had for him, even if he had ignored or misunderstood it. One afternoon, while he was in the living room, his sister Teresa called. Hearing her voice on the phone, he felt an unusual mixture of surprise and relief. "Hi, Teresa," he said, in a reserved tone, not quite sure how to interact with her after so much time. "Hi, Daniel. I just wanted to know how things were going at the house," Teresa responded, her tone soft, almost hesitant. Daniel paused before responding, aware that the words he chose in that moment carried special weight. "It hasn't been easy, Teresa, but I'm understanding things I never imagined. Mom, she was different from what I thought all these years. It seems like she was always there, even when I had distanced myself." There was silence on the other end, and then Teresa responded with a sincerity that surprised Daniel. "I felt that too, Daniel. I think, in a way, Mom was trying to show us something beyond the memories we had of her. Something deeper, something that goes beyond our preconceived notions." Daniel nodded, though she couldn't see him. He felt that, for the first time in a long time, he and his sister truly understood each other, beyond words. "Maybe we all drifted apart because we never knew how to see Mom as she really was," Daniel murmured, almost as a confession. "I always thought I distanced myself because she didn't understand me, but now I see that maybe I was the one who never tried to understand her." Teresa remained silent, as if she too were processing her own reflections. Finally, she responded with a gentle voice. "It's not too late to change, Daniel. Maybe we can all make peace with the past and with ourselves." That night, Daniel reflected on his sister's words and on what he had discovered in the house. He felt that, somehow, his mother had left him an unexpected gift, the opportunity to rebuild ties with his family, to recover something he had thought lost. On the last day, before leaving, he went to the attic once more. He sat next to the box of books and, with a nostalgic smile, leafed through one of his favorite childhood titles. His mother had written in the margin of the first page, "Never forget that you are valuable, Daniel." No matter how far you go, you will always have a home here." Those words moved him deeply. He placed his mother's notebook in his bag, feeling that, in some way, this object was the most precious inheritance he could receive. In that attic, he understood that the true legacy his mother had left them wasn't material, but emotional, a chain of love and understanding that, if they allowed it, could bring the family together once again. As he left the house, Daniel looked one last time toward the garden, toward the windows that had once watched him grow, and for the first time, he felt that place was his home, not because of the memories, but because of the love his mother had left in every corner. The winter afternoon was tinted with a soft golden light when Claudia arrived once more at the family home. After spending her days there and reconnecting with part of her past, something inside her still called her to return. The experience of her siblings, who had also spent their week in the house, had made her reflect deeply. Her mother's message, the last lesson she had left them, seemed to resonate with each of them in unexpected ways, awakening in all a yearning for reconciliation, understanding, and healing together. Claudia sat in the living room, surrounded by the same old furniture, the same scent of wood and flowers that her mother had loved. Just a few minutes later, the door opened slowly, and Teresa entered, followed by Felipe and Daniel. They had agreed to meet that day, as if all of them, in some inexplicable way, understood that the process their mother had started with her will was not yet complete. The lesson would not be whole until they shared it together. "I don't know if this is what Mom expected when she left us this house for a week," Felipe said, settling into the armchair across from Claudia, "but I don't think I've spent this much time here since we were kids." Teresa nodded as she looked at the details of the living room as if seeing them for the first time. With a nostalgic smile, she added, "It's strange. For years I felt like this house was some sort of prison. Now I see it differently. Mom managed to make every corner hold something of us, of who we once were and what she wanted for us." Daniel, who was standing by the window, turned to look at his siblings. He held the same book he had found in the attic in his hands, as if that object encapsulated the entire experience he had lived. "Did Mom say anything to you about memories?" he asked softly. "For me, she made me remember all those times I underestimated her. I thought she didn't understand me, and now I see she was taking care of me in ways I never understood." Claudia nodded, acknowledging she had experienced something similar. She opened the notebook she had found in her mother's room and, in a reflective pause, looked at her siblings. "She left each of us something different, but I feel that all her letters, all those memories she forced us to relive, shared the same lesson. She was reminding us who we were, who we could be. I think that even though she left us with individual tasks, she hoped that in the end, we'd come together here, like now, to unite those pieces." There was a moment of silence as the siblings absorbed those words. For the first time in a long time, each of them felt that the resentments and barriers that had separated them were beginning to fade. The house, which had always been a place of judgment and expectations, was becoming a place of understanding. Teresa looked at her siblings and, in an act of vulnerability she rarely showed, spoke sincerely. "For years, I thought Mom never valued me. I thought she always saw me as less than you, as someone who would never live up to her expectations. But after this week, after what I found in the garden, I realized that was only something I believed. Mom understood me more than I thought. Maybe I just didn't know how to see her way of loving us." Felipe, who usually appeared carefree, looked at Teresa with a serious expression and nodded. "You're right, Teresa. I think we all carried that idea at some point of not being what Mom expected, and maybe that's why we drifted apart. We all thought we were letting her down. But now I see that, really, she just wanted us to be happy, not to lose who we really are." Daniel, who had remained silent, looked at his siblings and let out a soft, slightly sad laugh. "It's ironic, isn't it? We spent our whole lives thinking we were strangers to each other, that Mom treated us as different, separate projects. And now, after all this, I realize we were far more alike than we thought." Claudia smiled, feeling that, for the first time, they were truly connecting, speaking from the heart and sharing their experiences without fear. It was as if, in that living room, they could let down all the masks they had worn for so many years. "So, what do we do now?" Felipe asked with a sincere expression. If Mom left us this to teach us something, I think she also expected us to do something about it. Claudia looked around, her eyes stopping on every corner of the room, and stood up, heading to the shelf where her mother used to keep an old wooden box she used as a memory chest. She opened it and found a series of old photos of them when they were young, along with a note in the familiar handwriting. The note read, "My dear children, this house was my heart, and you every beat. My greatest wish was that you would find here the love and unity I always wanted for you. This home will belong to whoever chooses to care for it and keep its spirit alive, but I hope you all find in it a place to return to, a home that will never stop welcoming you." Their mother's words seemed to have crossed time, as if she knew that moment would come and that, after all, her children would understand. A silence filled with respect and love settled in the room. The four siblings looked at each other, recognizing in each other's eyes the emotions they shared, the wounds that were healing, and the love they were rediscovering. Finally, Teresa was the first to speak, with a calm smile on her lips. "I propose we take care of the house together. That we keep coming, not just to remember Mom, but so that, in each visit, we remember what she did for us. Let this house be the place where we all have a refuge." Felipe nodded, visibly moved. "I agree. I want my life to have more than scattered memories. This place can be our meeting point where we can grow, where we can keep being a family." Claudia, who had been the most skeptical at the beginning, felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Mom left us one last lesson. We can't bring her back, but we can honor her love by keeping the promise of staying together." Daniel, moved, nodded silently. He felt that his mother, through those details, her letters and memories, had managed to heal something deep within each of them. He knew he was no longer alone, that he wouldn't have to face life on his own, and that this house would always be a place he could return to. That night, the four siblings stayed in the living room, sharing memories, laughter, and, for the first time, speaking without reservation. The house, now filled with a warm light and an atmosphere of reconciliation, seemed to have regained its essence. Outside, the wind blew softly, and in the garden, the flowers they had once planted together swayed their petals as if silently sharing the end of a story that, despite time and distance, had never lost its meaning. That morning, Claudia woke up in the same room where she had slept as a child. She had decided to stay in the house with her siblings the previous night, a spontaneous choice, but one that felt necessary. As she gazed at the ceiling, her hands clasped behind her head, a mix of peace and gratitude washed over her. Something inside her had changed profoundly. After years of living with a shield of self-sufficiency and detachment, she now felt that the house and her siblings connected her with a part of her life she had relegated to the past. She went down to the living room and found Felipe making coffee in their mother's old coffee pot. The aroma filled the house, awakening memories and creating a homely atmosphere they hadn't experienced in years. Felipe looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Claudia. Today's the big day," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee and handing it to her. "The big day?" she asked, smiling with curiosity as she took the cup. "Well, let's say today we decide what will happen with this house." Felipe paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I think Mom was right to leave us with this process. It's as if each of us, by coming here, found something we needed, something we'd forgotten." Claudia nodded, silently acknowledging the truth of those words. At that moment, Teresa and Daniel came down, still in their pajamas, with peaceful expressions on their faces. "Good morning," greeted Teresa, heading to the couch and wrapping herself in a blanket nearby. "I hope you're ready for an important decision," said Daniel, trying to sound casual, though his tone reflected the same uncertainty they all felt. They sat together in the living room, their coffee cups warming their hands, the air filled with the softness of the morning. There was a comfortable silence among them, full of the trust they had built over those days, until Claudia finally dared to break it. Mom left us this house not just as a material inheritance, but as a place for reconnection, she said softly. I think none of us understood her intention at first, but now, I feel like I understand. This house was her way of reminding us that we always have a place to come back to. Teresa looked at her siblings with a serious but tender expression. It's true. I realize that if each of us leaves, this house will be empty again. It will become a cold, soulless building, and it will be as if our family story disappears. I think Mom wanted us to keep this place alive, to fill it with memories, as we did when we were children. Felipe, who had always been the most carefree, looked at them and, with a slight sigh, nodded. It's strange, isn't it? I always thought I didn't need this place. I always told myself that family was just a memory, something I could carry in my mind without needing a physical space. But now, I realize this place is more than walls and furniture. It's as if Mom is in every corner, in every detail. And I don't think I want to lose that. Daniel, who had been listening silently, finally spoke, his voice soft and reflective. What if we make this house ours? We could keep it, restore it, even make small changes to adapt it to our lives now. We don't have to live here all the time, but we could use it to gather, to keep alive the bond that Mom left us. It would be a way to honor her, to remember that, no matter what happens, we're still family. They all fell silent, digesting Daniel's proposal. They felt that, somehow, the idea made sense, that it represented something they all wanted, though they hadn't admitted it until now. Finally, Claudia spoke, with a smile that reflected a mix of nostalgia and resolve. I like the idea. This house doesn't have to be just a memory or an occasional visit. If we all agree, we could restore it and make it ours again. We could fill it with life again, just as Mom wanted. Teresa nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. Imagine it. We could come with our own families, spend holidays here, just like when we were kids. It could be our refuge, a place where we'll always have something to bind us. Felipe smiled, a spark of enthusiasm lighting up his eyes. Well, I guess we'll need to make a repair list and do some planning. But I like the idea. I feel that if we can accomplish this together, it'll be the best tribute we could give Mom. They spent the rest of the morning talking about how they wanted to restore the house, making a list of the repairs and changes they wanted, each one contributing ideas and memories. The plans flowed naturally, and in every decision, they felt they were creating something new, something that belonged to all of them. That afternoon, when they went out to the garden, Teresa suggested planting a tree in honor of their mother, a symbol of life and growth that would endure alongside the house. They all agreed, and with their hands in the soil, they felt that act represented a new stage for them as siblings. As they planted the tree, Daniel looked up and observed the house, its walls filled with memories and now charged with a renewed energy. You know, he said, in a deep and reflective voice, sometimes I think about all the time we lost, all the things we didn't experience together. But at least now we can make it right. We can create something that connects us in the present. Claudia, wiping her hands free of soil, nodded. That's true, Daniel. Mom gave us one last chance to recover what we let go, and I think this is just the beginning. If we keep this house alive, we'll be keeping her legacy alive too. At the end of the day, the four siblings sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the garden, feeling that, in that moment, they had reconnected in the most genuine and profound way possible. It was as if all the distances, all the resentments, had been left behind, replaced by a sense of unity and gratitude. As the sun began to set and the sky filled with golden and purple hues, the siblings shared a silence filled with peace. Each of them, in their heart, knew that their mother would be proud, that she had achieved something more than a simple family reunion. She had restored the bonds between them, reminded them of the value of family, and, through that final lesson, had given them a home they would never lose. That night, as they said goodbye, they knew they would return to the house again and again. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of something new, a cycle that would keep their mother's memory alive, along with the love she had taught them, a legacy that would endure beyond them. Like the roots of that tree that would now grow alongside the house and alongside them. Several months had passed since Claudia, Felipe, Teresa, and Daniel decided to restore the family house and make it a shared refuge. During that time, they dedicated themselves to repairing every corner, painting the worn-out walls, and replacing some furniture. But above all, they devoted themselves to filling the house with new memories. That old mansion, which had once been a symbol of distance and pain, had now become the heart of their family, a place that breathed love and unity. One summer afternoon, the siblings gathered in the garden. They had invited their families, friends, and close neighbors to a small celebration in honor of their mother. The sun bathed the garden in a warm golden light, while the scent of flowers filled the air. In front of the tree they had planted together, a symbol of life and growth, the four siblings gathered to say a few words. Daniel was the first to speak. "Today I want to thank Mom," Daniel said, his voice resonating with emotion as he looked at his siblings. "She taught us something that, although it took time to understand, was the greatest gift we could ever have. Not only this house, but also the chance to find each other again and learn how to be a family once more." Felipe, who was usually the least serious of all, continued with a solemn tone that surprised those present. "Mom knew that we all carried wounds, resentments that we had dragged along for years. By leaving us this house, she gave us a second chance to heal and remember what truly matters. Today, I feel that each of us has regained something valuable, ourselves and each other." Teresa, overcome with emotion, let a small tear escape, but her smile reflected peace and gratitude. "It's true. For a long time, I thought this house was just a place full of painful memories, a place I wanted to escape from. Now, every corner reminds me of how brave Mom was and how much love she had for us, even if we didn't always see it. Today we're here, together, because she believed we could change, that we could be more than our past." Finally, Claudia spoke. She looked at her siblings and then at the tree, that symbol of growth that now meant so much to them. "Mom showed us that love isn't always perfect or easy to understand, but it's worth keeping alive. This house is our home, and although she's not physically here, I know she's with us in every decision, in every memory, and in each one of us." The siblings remained silent, letting each other's words resonate in the air, and held hands. The emotion on their faces was evident, a mix of joy, peace, and gratitude for all they had achieved and healed. As the small celebration began, the guests joined them, sharing laughter and memories as they walked around the house and garden. Each person there could feel the warmth that now permeated that home, a place that had been restored not only in structure, but also in essence. Children ran through the garden, playing under the shade of the tree the siblings had planted in honor of their mother. It was a symbol of life and unity, and as they watched the new generations playing and laughing, Claudia, Felipe, Teresa, and Daniel felt that their family's story continued, that their mother's legacy remained alive, and that, thanks to her, they had the chance to write a new story together. That night, when the guests had left and the garden was calm, the four siblings sat on the porch under a starry sky. They didn't need to say anything. The silence was filled with gratitude and love. Around them, the house seemed to breathe with them, as if it, too, was at peace. In the starlight, each of them recalled the moments they had spent there during their week in the house, the lessons they had learned, and the memories they had relived. They understood that their mother had left more than a will. She had left a path to reconciliation, an opportunity to heal and grow. "I feel like Mom would be proud of us," Teresa said, breaking the silence. Felipe nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "She wouldn't just be proud. I think she'd say this is just the beginning. There are more things to build, more moments to live together." Daniel looked at his siblings and, for the first time, felt a certainty he hadn't had in years. It's true. Family isn't something static. It's something we build every day, with every gesture and every word. I think that's what Mom wanted us to understand. Claudia, Watching her siblings felt a deep peace, a peace that came from finally understanding her mother's lesson. "Then let's keep building," she said, looking at the tree, its branches beginning to reach toward the sky, a symbol of life and hope. That night, they went to their rooms with full hearts. Each understood that, although their mother was no longer physically present, her love and teachings would always accompany them. The house, the tree, and every corner of the home had become witnesses to a story of healing, rediscovery, and, above all, love. And so, the four siblings began a new chapter in their lives. Their mother's house became a place where memories and new beginnings intertwined. Over time, this place bore witness to many more gatherings, laughter, and celebrations. The tree grew strong, its branches embracing new generations, and each visit to the house became a tribute to their mother's memory, her legacy, and the family she had dreamed of building. In the end, they all understood that the love their mother had left them was the best gift, a love that, despite distance and differences, had endured in each of them. And with each gathering, each laugh, and each hug, the siblings felt that their mother was there with them, in that home that would always be theirs. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments, what would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a show of support. This motivates us to keep posting exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We truly value having you here with us, and you can click on the links appearing on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Take care.